Good morning, everyone. I have a couple of challenges today. First, I'm getting over a cold. My throat is a little bit scratchy. My voice might be a little bit weak, so I apologize if I fade out a little bit. But that's okay because we're also getting close to lunch. So I also am kind of the catch-up guy. So I'll try and maybe compress this just a little bit. As Tam mentioned, I joined the faculty at DRI in July. Prior to that, I was a Southeasterner, and I'm here courtesy of the shutdown. So this is my first Great Basin Climate Forum. It's good to be here. And if you have not been assiduously checking your information phones, I have an announcement as of an hour or so ago. The Senate passed a bipartisan deal to reopen the government and avoid the shutdown. It has not yet been passed by the House, but apparently this is the deal that we've been reading about that would reopen the government through, January 15th and push the debt ceiling up until February 7th. So we have kicked the can.
But not in time to relieve you of who's speaking up.
Right. So you still have to listen to me for a good 15 minutes. Right. So I'll talk a little bit about this patch-proxy climate change hypothesis that I've sort of been working on. But first, I would like to show you some pictures from camp. So I came out here, as I mentioned, in July, and one of the first groups that I had a chance to interact with that Tam and Kelly and a couple of people at DRI helped introduce me to was the Climate Science Centers and an opportunity that they provided for new folks to the region. So you're all probably somewhat familiar with the Climate Science Centers. These were established in 2010. They're federally led research collaborations to provide objective scientific information and tools to managers to help managers anticipate, monitor, and adapt to climate change. And there are climate science centers for each region of the country. The Pacific Northwest Climate Science Center had this idea as part of its mission to foster a community between scientists and managers that were interested in climate change, science, and adaptation. And this was incarnated as an idea called Climate Boot Camp. This was an experience that did not involve a lot of calisthenics or camouflage, but involved this year 23 nominated fellows and 30 instructors. Both the participants and instructors came from a wide diversity of backgrounds, everything from graduate students to federal managers, people at the policy level, people from tribal organizations, and faculty members from both the instructor and participant standpoint. So it was quite a diverse group of folks, and I should mention this was from all over the country coming to the Pacific Northwest. I was nominated and sponsored by the Southwest Climate Science Center to go. The objectives of the Climate Boot Camp, I'm going to try to use the clicker here, were to examine some of the climate change drivers and impacts. Let's see here. To share some recently developed and discovered climate science among managers and scientists, to describe the authorities and mandates of some of the relevant agencies involved in climate science research, to develop skills for integrating different types of knowledge, data, and information, and also to enhance communication skills for sharing climate knowledge with a variety of audiences, including the person that you're going to sit next to on the plane next week or next month. The Climate Boot Camp has been going on only for a few years. I think 2011 was the first year of this activity. The 2013 year took place at the McCall Outdoor Science School at the University of Idaho in beautiful McCall. So this was the end of my first month in this region. So I got to escape some of the heat from northern Nevada, see some trees again. This was a nice experience. And it actually, it took place in these bunkhouse camp style situations. So it was a little bit different from the conference scenario that I was expecting. There were no hotels and open bars or anything. There were bunkhouses and sleeping bags. And there were 4 days of varying experiences. Day 1 focused on climate science. Day 2 is integrating types of knowledge. There was a field day, and there was a communications day. I'll just briefly describe these as well. So the Climate Science 101 day gave kind of an introduction to people like me who were new to the region. Talked about the climate of the Pacific Northwest, some of the larger climatic drivers of the region to pay attention to. And we talked a little bit about some of the global climate change trends. Spoiler alert, the temperatures are increasing. We discussed a little bit of the effects of climate on ecosystems. The second day was quite interesting for those of us from the sciences. We talked about integrating different types of knowledge. Of course, we talked about the objective scientific data. We talked about traditional ecological knowledge, how to integrate that into climate science research and storytelling. And we also talked about integrating natural resources manager knowledge, the people who are out there on the ground every day collecting these observations, not always in data form, but which nevertheless have value because they occur over long periods in human terms. There was a field day. Folks from the U.S. Forest Service took us to some great field locations where we talked about issues of fire and fire pathogen interactions and how those could be affected by climatic change. Issues of water, quality, quantity, delivery, temperature in large watersheds, and also, of course, how that can interact with things like post-fire responses. We also, of course, talked about fish, both from a white settler perspective, as well as folks from the Yakima tribe and from the Nez Perce tribe talked about management efforts and how those could be affected by climatic change. And then day 4, there was the communications day. We talked about public views of climate change. One of the things that we discussed was that the public in general trusts scientists, but still the public think there is not consensus among scientists about climate change, which unfortunately leads to a low priority among the public. We also have a messaging issue. The public tends to think of the word preparedness as a more motivating term than adaptation was one of the big takeaways from this day. When you talk about disaster preparedness, people sort of pay attention and start a mental checklist. When you don't really hear the term disaster adaptation, nobody adapts to a hurricane or a flood or a fire. So that was one thing that we brought home that we were asked to promulgate to our colleagues. Another exercise that was really interesting for me as a scientist was to go through exercises with people who are expert at storytelling and messaging. We actually had a PR firm talk to us about how to convey climate change research. And when was the last time you had a person from a PR consulting firm groom you on how to deliver your talk, right? So one of the things that we talked about was elements of narratives, elements of stories. Stories are effective at communicating urgency when they have a story of me, a story of us, and a story of now, a challenge and a choice and an opportunity. So I'm an assistant professor of fire ecology now. I was back in Florida. I was a volunteer firefighter. My dad was a volunteer firefighter. My grandfather and his father were fire chiefs. So I'm a 4th generation firefighter. I've also been red carded wildland firefighter since 2008. So I've got a history with fire before I was an academic. And one of the things that we see, not only as academics, but as firefighters, is people coming back from things like the rim fire. Every wildland fire season, we hear people saying more and more, wow, I've never seen fire intensity like that. I've never seen fire behavior like that. We hear these stories more and more. And we know what drives fire behavior. We know some of the factors include fuel loading and tree density and all of these ecological factors. We also know that there are some climatic factors that are into it. There are a lot of really complex interactions. But one thing, and so there's some disagreement, but one thing we know is that these patterns that we're seeing are going to increase. Next year, there will be more people coming back and saying, I've never seen a fire like that before. And we know that the costs of addressing these fires is going to increase both in terms of financial cost and in the number of people who go out and risk their lives to protect life and property, and some of whom may get injured, some of whom may not make it back. And so we have the opportunity to address that based on the science that we have now, or we can continue to watch these costs mount because we know that that's what's going to happen. So that's an example of the type of storytelling that we got experience engaging in. So that was quite useful. One of the outcomes that I thought was pretty interesting from this climate boot camp experience, of course up in the upper left there were some team building exercises, which is all nice and fuzzy. And as a result, interestingly, I got to know a lot of people who are feds in the Pacific Northwest region, and I can contact them now because despite the shutdown, I have their personal cell phone numbers. I can contact them on Facebook, as I did a couple of weeks ago, to ask a question about endangered species policy in NEPA. And of course, the person was not officially working, but I got some useful information. So we were connected in some really good ways with a bunch of other folks throughout the region through this experience. There was also a blog site, of course, for early career scientists who are sharing information and interactions that they're having with folks like the public. Some say it's just a hoax, is the title of one young climate scientist's posting. Changing style mid-breath, communicating climate change research to different audiences is another. And it's interesting to see these accounts in some ways of people who are sitting in an airplane seat and having a real conversation with someone who at the end of a 2-hour flight may have a little bit different idea about the consensus among scientists regarding climate change, if you can adapt your message correctly to that. So to debrief a little bit from Climate Boot Camp, I guess I'm serving as a bit of an ambassador for that experience. It was a really valuable experience for me as a newcomer to the region, as a newcomer to all these networks of climate scientists and managers. And I would highly recommend if you see an opportunity to be involved, whether as an instructor or as a participant, or if you know someone who could get value out of it as a participant, I think it's fantastically useful. The future of this experience is somewhat in question. The Northwest Climate Science Center has not decided whether they will be able to expand the program. They're simply concerned that making it larger might dilute some of the value of the experience, or to kind of transfer the model among different climate science centers and have them in different regions. But regardless, it looks like the opportunities will increase for this sort of experience. So I think that's really good news. Let me just check how I'm doing on time here. So without any segue at all, I'll now move to a different place and a different topic. As I mentioned, I came from Florida, back east, and one of the places where I've spent the last few years doing research is extreme southern Florida. So this is the Florida Everglades that you may have heard about. Here's Miami, one of the other places in Florida that you might have passed through. And this was one of my research sites, a Big Cypress National Preserve. It's part of the national park system. I learned when I got here that this is a relatively small block of land. It's 750,000 acres of protected land. It does have the largest prescribed burn program in the National Park Service. So for fire ecologists, it's a great living laboratory. One of the interesting features of this particular landscape I noticed as I was getting familiar with it is if you zoom in just to maybe a 20 or 10 by 20 mile or so little rectangle, the landscape looks kind of moth-eaten here. If you take a look, there are all these little gray circles, and if you're flying into Miami and you look out the left side of the window, or if you rent a helicopter, you can see that the landscape, literally for as far as the eye can see from the plane window, is flat but interrupted by these little patches, these little dome-like terrain features. So these are thousands and thousands of variously sized wetland forest patches. They're little tiny cypress swamps They're literally called domes locally because they kind of look like little domes. And so they occupy depressions in this really otherwise flat landscape. Topography is another thing that I've really been enjoying seeing out here in Bishop. So there's topography in southern Florida too. This background landscape, it experiences flow, and it has a background landscape slope of about 5 centimeters per kilometer. So these are deep depressions in the landscape. These are a couple of meters deep, and that's all that you need in this landscape to go from what we would call their uplands to these wetland forests. So there's a seasonal hydrological difference as well. There's a wet season and a dry season because we're pretty much in the tropics in this place. So you go from these little cypress domes being inundated to being fairly dry. And I was interested in how microclimate would change as you go from outside of these things to the edge, to the middle, and to the center. Most folks have probably heard about edge effects in ecology and how as you go toward the center of a forest, there's kind of a buffering effect. You get higher relative humidities, lower temperatures compared to areas outside because you get kind of a thermal mass, you get shading, all these sorts of things going on. And so this was a project in my dissertation where I did in fact find that as everyone would expect, you see, this thing up here in the top, I promised I'd only show one graph. This is temperature and this is relative humidity down here. So basically the story of this graph is that as you go from the outside of these patches to their edges and on into their centers, you get lower temperatures and you get higher relative humidity. So it's moister and it's cooler on the inside of these things. Something else that we found was that the smaller patches, again, as you'd expect, because the smaller patches have a higher amount of area in relation to higher amount of edge in relation to their area. They experience greater swings in temperature and humidity. So they're driven by greater climatic extremes. And so the larger patches are more buffered against whatever's going on their outside. This is just an illustration of what it looks like on the inside of these little tiny cypress swamps during the wet season. These are some cute little tropical plants. You have brunimiliads and air plants and orchids everywhere. And during the dry season, the water levels decrease, the plants are still there, but you find that there is an immense layer of duff and peat and a lot of fuels. So I mentioned that you have uplands, and I mentioned there's a lot of fire. And so one of the things that can happen is during this dry season, you can get an ignition that occurs on the outside in these pine forests, which are, I guess, perhaps somewhat analogous to some of the lower elevation ponderosa pine forests out here that historically burn fairly frequently. And the fire can enter in and actually burn into these peat layers and release tremendous amounts of carbon and generate really persistent peat fires. So what our thinking is that since in these smaller patches you have greater temperature and humidity swings, you get greater drying during the dry season. And as the climate warms and dries out in this region, the potential for these fires to occur could be greater. And so this got me to thinking, could we actually use these ranges of sizes of these different patches as proxies? We already have elevational proxies, and we have latitudinal gradients that we use as proxies for what could happen under different scenarios of climate change. My question became, well, can we use variously sized patches as well? So I arrived out here with that thought, and coming out here from Florida, I knew that there would be certain differences. So I did some research. So going from the other place you might have heard of in Florida or been to, Orlando, to say Reno, for example, I experienced a change in precipitation of about an order of magnitude or so. I found out, much to my disappointment, that it was going to be colder, higher up and a lot drier and stuff. So, but I still thought, well, surely there are these landscape patches around here. So I just took a little tour around the world on Google Earth, and you can find in these instances literally patterned landscapes in places like Zaire. This is Wyoming in the upper right. It's called ribbon forest. In the lower left, this is a peatland in Finland. And then this is actually a coral reef in Australia. So these types of patterned, patchy landscapes occur all over the place. So I kind of spent a little bit of time the other night on Google Earth flying around the Great Basin, and recall from that earlier slide that I was really attuned to looking for little round patches in the landscape. So this was the first thing that I decided. So I'm still scratching my head about whether these bizarre circles could be used as proxies in some way for scenarios of climate change. But this is only a half joke. Perhaps there's some way in which these could be useful. There are somewhat more natural landscape patches that you see. You can obviously find fragments of various sizes and configurations of forest at a variety of elevations. Whether it's anthropogenic, for example, on the ski slope, I think this is Slide Mountain, to more natural ones. Here you have both a combination of a fragmented alpine forest and also some wet meadows there on the upper left, which are hydrologically connected, but in some ways which are distinct enough that they could perhaps be used in some way for forecasting what could potentially happen under scenarios of climate change, because you have different ratios of edge to area. So I think that's pretty much all the time that I have, and that's all the slides that I've got. And so I'll be happy to entertain any questions if we have time, or maybe if we want to just move straight into lunch, Tamara.